Ben Carson is in the news. He went on a podcast, Politico podcast, and he had a lot to say about race and President Obama. So, but first, let's hear what he had to say about whether there's racism in the Republican Party.
Well, first of all, I don't find any particular problem being an African American in the Republican Party. The people, I know that in the progressive side of things, they like to say that the Republicans are racist. I know that. I haven't experienced that.
So you think these criticisms by progressives, principally the MSNBCs and all those folks, and even some people sort of close to Obama, you think the criticisms that some of the critiques of the White House and the Obama in general were rooted in racism? Do you think there's any justification in that at all?
Very little. I've been around for 64 years. I've had a chance to see what real racism is.
When was the last experience that you personally had with what you would consider to be real racism in your life?
Well, you don't have to go too far. I think the way that I am treated, by the left is racism.
Really?
Yeah, because they assume because you're black, you have to think a certain way. And if you don't think that way, you're Uncle Tom, you're worthy of every horrible epithet they could come up with.
All right, so it's racism, it turns out, all comes from progressives, and there's no racism on the right. Obama has not been subjected to racism as far as Ben Carson knows. Obviously, Ben Carson has not done a Google image search for Obama and Africa because he would be exposed to a great deal if he were to do that. But so that's his perspective, is that racism is all on the left for the most part. And although I always thought that if you talk about race, that makes you a racist. So he must be the real racist.
Well, he's
right?
race baiting, right?
Yeah, that's what he's. Yeah.
He's race baiting. Now we're race baiting by talking about race. All right, so this idea that someone is not black enough or not white enough or not Asian enough is, for me, I have a personal hatred for that because
you're not Asian enough.
I've been accused of that, and I've been accused by other people of being too Asian. You're just too Asian. Why can't you assimilate more? And it's usually other Asians who make these assessments, and it's super annoying. I think you should be who you are and judged as an individual, obviously.
Okay, let's go to the second clip. So this is where Ben Carson also talks about, Steve's so eager, also talks about Obama and his experience.
But hold on, I will give Ben Carson credit for, well, it's a minor credit, but he's right in the sense that there's definitely racism from both sides. Now, the quantity and the quality of the racism is very different. For him to say that the only real racism, whatever he means by that, came from the left is ridiculous, of course.
Well, it's a real surprise that his campaign isn't catching fire. But so okay, let's go to the second clip of him on Politico talking about Obama's experience.
You curious at all about what his experience was like? I mean, did you when he was elected?
Which experience?
The experience of being elected. Did you derive any joy out of that? Any sense of pride? How did you sort of feel? How did you process that?
I did not. I mean, like most Americans, I was proud that we broke the color barrier when he was elected. But I also recognize that his experience and my experience are night and day different. He didn't grow up like I grew up by any stretch of the imagination. Not even close. He was, raised white. Many of his formative years were spent in Indonesia. So for him to, claim that, he identifies with the experience of black Americans, I think is a bit of a stretch.
All right, so it's a bit of a stretch for Obama to claim that he experienced life, grew up as an African American. And I think that Ben Carson here is trying to depict the tableau, the wide tableau that is the African American experience in the United States, and say that everybody's experience is different, but we're all African Americans, right? Or is it the opposite of that? I'm sorry, my mistake. He's actually saying the opposite of that. He said Obama is an African American, but not really a black American, because he did not share that experience growing up that Ben Carson did. And I think that it really falls to the three of us to determine who is and is not a legitimate black person.
The only person who's better equipped to determine whether a black person is black enough than us is Darrell Issa.
Darrell Issa, San Diego-based Republican Congressman Darrell Issa, but unfortunately he doesn't say anything about it. Oh, wait a minute, did he?
Did he?
Maybe he did. Let's hear.
Well, you know, I know the doctor. He spoke before a charity that I'm also involved in. He is a great surgeon, a wonderful human being, and he was technically correct in what he said. But again, this is the reason that political loose talk by people who are just beginning to do it is always a problem in real statesmanship. You can say that when you're a private citizen and you're technically accurate, but when you're running for president, you need to look at what you're running for and not get mired down.
All right, so what Darrell Issa is saying is, yes, he's technically correct that Obama is not really black, but he shouldn't say it because he's running for president, and that is the type of divisive talk about race that Obama has been engaging in.
Just say it privately.
Say it privately. Yeah.
Just
you
say
keep
privately.
keep your race comments to, when you're just with other people who are not going to report to the press.
All right, again, Ben Carson, maybe I'm just trying to give him too much credit. Ben Carson does have a point that African Americans have a different experience than Africans who came here as immigrants from Africa or from the Caribbean or anywhere else. And also African Americans who left America at a certain age and spent their years abroad, maybe Kobe Bryant, for example, right? Maybe that's a bad example. But people like that have a different experience growing up. And I say this a little bit from my perspective because Asians who grew up, let's say in Kentucky, in a very non-Asian part of the country, are very different than Asians who grew up in Hawaii, for example. And so I grew up in Virginia and then in New Jersey. So when I got to college, I had some bad racist experiences. So if someone said, hey, you chink, whatever, those are fighting words, right? So I was like ready to encounter them. But like my friends from Hawaii, they were like, what? That's hilarious. I think that guy said something racist. Am I supposed to be offended? Like they didn't care because they were the dominant race. So they didn't care if someone said racist things. They're like, whatever. So maybe that's the privilege of being the dominant race, that racist comments towards you don't matter. So there's a qualitative difference between any race growing up in one part of the U.S. versus another part of the U.S. or even outside the U.S.
But if you think about Ben Carson's experience, he grew up in Detroit, predominantly black area. His parents obviously both black, and versus Obama, who was raised by his white grandparents, I guess to a certain degree. There are
which he's always admitted.
Yeah, no,
he said this is how I was raised.
But for one thing, that's got its own real challenges when you have, you're isolated that way. Like you talk about the kids in Kentucky, and you're the only one. I mean, his experience is very unusual. Obama being black, raised by white grandparents in predominantly white areas, and having to adjust to that. Versus Ben Carson, who he did live in a community where he was part of that culture. Whereas Obama is, he's experiencing growing up a whole different culture than most other African Americans. And so Ben Carson is right about that, but why that means that Obama, he should be disparaging him as not really black. Let's see Obama, before he became president, obviously, when he was a teenager or whatever, try to catch a cab in downtown in Manhattan. And he's going to have the same black experience that Ben Carson had, which is he's walking or taking the bus.
Yeah. Generally, racists don't ask, "Hey, man, did your white grandparents raise you?"
Right.
They don't think that, or they don't think, "Hey, this guy's from Kenya. It's not quite the same thing."
I think what Ben Carson is saying though is that because Obama grew up with certain privileges, such as living part of his time abroad, he went to Punahou, which is one of the best high schools.
No, that's true.
In Hawaii. So having that kind of access to elite education and travel abroad is in some ways a white, childhood in the mind of Ben Carson. I think that's what he's saying, right? And now he's saying because of that, he's the real black president, which is bullshit because we all know the real first black president was Bill Clinton.
I'm just thinking all those racists who, the ones who did put together all those images online of Obama with a bone through his nose and all that, they must feel so stupid now that it turns out he's not really black.
So all those, first of all those guys have to, what Ben Carson wants is all those guys have to come first and he's like, no, you put those bones in my nose. That's what he wants, first of all, because he's the real black president. But this guy doesn't understand irony. He finished the first thing by saying, the real racism that I've experienced comes from Democrats because they call me Uncle Tom and all this stuff, and they say I'm not the right kind of black person because I'm a Republican. And then goes on to say 5 minutes later, so you know who the real not black person is? President Obama. Because I don't understand it. I just complained about people doing that to me, and I'm going to do that to someone else. Because that makes all the sense in the world. So every time someone who's sells themselves out like this guy's been doing, it's always based on themselves. It's a selfish thing to do. We already know that. So he doesn't experience racism until that's to do with him. Everyone else has no racist experiences. Nothing. They've never been. No bias has been put against them. Only me. Only me. It's all about me. So it's the same type of person that appears on Handy's show, his panel of black folks. It's always about themselves, then promoting their book and promoting their show and promoting their podcast, promoting this. It's about them. It's a selfish point of view. So you don't understand anyone else's experiences because you only think about yourself all the time. So it's not even that he's Uncle Tom. He's just selfish. And he thinks, I'm the only person who exists here. That guy, no, I need to be that because it's most important to me. So that's really where his motivation comes from.
Do you like him, JR?
We should be honest with the audience, however, about JR, that JR was the only African-American at his high school. Is that correct, JR?
At my last one.
Your last high school. So he doesn't really know what it's like to be black.
So the basis for experiencing racism isn't about who you were raised by. It's about what society does to you. Mm-hmm. So he's like, there's no real racism, which I cut pieces of that early because he said it doesn't happen in the Republican Party. Maybe he said you have to look for things in order to experience it. So again, he contradicts himself because he's only looking for racism that he experiences himself.